So let's discuss about matter in this video. So what is matter? So and matter in our surroundings, what do we come across? So anything that gives a sensation of touch or feel is called a matter. Anything that produces a sensation of touch or feel is a matter. And touch or feel, anything that gives us a sensation of touch or feel has the two important categories and properties that occupies space. Anything that we can touch occupies space and has mass. It fills a space, means it occupies a volume. It has mass. Anything that we touch or feel occupies space and has mass. So these two are the two important properties of matter. Properties, or we can say the nature of matter. Properties of matter. Okay, so anything that gives us a sensation of touch or feel is a matter, and that occupies space and has mass. Okay, it occupies space as mass. So how do we categorize them? So we see different things around us which are loosely called matter, and we see different things. We see a thing which does not change in shape. So let us say we call this an object. Suppose a remote control, a mobile phone, or something that does not change its shape. So something which is rigid and does not change its shape, we call that thing, or that is still occupies some space and mass, we have that a solid. We call that as a solid. There is some more thing that you can just put that in a container and it takes the shape of the container, which we know. So which flow from, you can actually it does not have a definite shape, but you can actually transfer from one container to another container. We can still keep it in a container that takes the shape of the container. We call it liquid. And there is one more thing. These two things we can see clearly with our eyes and we can touch them. The other thing is that what fills, so we breathe air. So what fills the room? If you just stand on the shore, you get a cool breeze. So that is something we can only feel, we won't be able to see. So that we call, that is still can be put in a container or in a balloon, we call it gas. These are three major categories of things, or we call matter around us. Solid, that have a definite shape, definite shape, and liquid takes the shape of the container, and gas, which also takes the shape, but we won't be able to see clearly with our eyes. So solid, liquid, gas, these are three major categories of matter in our surroundings. In addition to these two exotic states are there. So what are star stuff made of? What are star stuff made of? Stars are made up of a different kind of matter which we call plasma. And after Einstein and Indian scientist Bose contribution to theoretical physics and Bose and Einstein theoretical physics, there is a different state of matter that we can bring about, which we call Bose Einstein condensate. Condensate. Just because they are having different properties. So that puts the total types of matter into five different categories. There are five states of matter exist. Five states of matter, not an object. Five states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, solid, liquid, gas, plasma, and Bose-Einstein condensate. So since we require higher level of physics understanding to talk about Bose-Einstein condensate. Let us just eliminate this from our discussion. Let's talk about these four first. So, what is the major difference between the matter in our surroundings and the matter that which is made of stars? Here we know that matter, if you keep on dividing the matter, you will come up to a smallest portion which we cannot further divide, that we call atoms or molecules. So this, any solid or an object, if you keep on dividing and the size gets smaller and smaller, finally will come an indivisible portion, after which it loses its character. So that indivisible portion, in some cases it is an atom, in some cases it is a molecule. So that we discussed about it already in the atomic structure. So atom or molecule. In, we know that atoms and molecules are made of, like there is a core of positive charge which we call nucleus, in which protons and neutrons lie and the electrons are revolving around it. So in solid, liquid and gas, electrons are revolving around the nucleus. Electrons are revolving around the nucleus. But whereas in the case of plasma, it is happening at only at very high temperature, very high temperature, that electrons gain sufficient energy, they just move away from the nucleus. Here, none of the electrons, none of the electrons, electrons revolve around any of the nucleus. So here, but solid, liquid and gas, all the electrons are revolving around the nucleus. But here in plasma state, the none of the electrons are revolving around any of the nucleus, so that the character of plasma will be entirely different from solid, liquid and gas. That is why plasma is called a different states of matter. Essentially, we have got five states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, plasma and Bose-Einstein condensate. In solid, liquid and gas, we have all the electrons are revolving around the nucleus. Here we can put solids are having definite shape, whereas liquids and gases do not have. They can flow from one place to another place. So liquids and gases together are called fluids. So solids and fluids. In everyday life, we come across only two different categories of matter. One is solids and the other one is fluids. Fluids included liquids and gases. Liquids and gases are called fluids. So now, what are the effects that we can bring about on these solids and fluids? And what is the nature? Suppose you take a sponge. It's a sponge. It's a sponge. If you just pour some water into the sponge, you won't see the water is leaking. The water gets absorbed in the sponge. So when you pour little water onto the sponge, onto it, so it absorbs. Why? Because we know that a sponge contains a lot of air follicles, air, tiny spaces between them. So when water is poured onto this and the water is filling the space, that is vacuum, so that is empty. So that is why water is not coming out and we call it absorbed. Similar kind of phenomena takes place in liquids and fluids, I mean liquids and gases. What is the case? Suppose you take a container and in that you keep some water. If you put salt into it and the salt just dissolves in water, salt dissolves in water, dissolves in water, and you do not see the salt is just floating somewhere or it just gets dissolved and disappeared. Dissolves in water means it just disappeared into water. So what happens? The water, or here it is a kind of liquid, had spaces between them, and the salt particles or the salt atoms or molecules just go and fill in those spaces. That is why we are not able to see them. This clearly shows that there is enough space between water particles or liquid particles to accommodate other particles. And the gases, obviously, no question about them. The gas, suppose in a corner of the room, if you light an incense stick, that gas just comes to even the furthest corner of the room, so that gets diffused. The air has so much of space in between the particles, so that even the incense stick, that smoke that fills the room, it goes to any corner. So it is very clearly shows that there is even very much of space between the gas particles, and the space between the gas particles are less but solids. But sponge is not a true solid because there are gaps in it. Suppose if you take a true solid, say for example a very solid like wood, suppose if you try to pour water into it, it absorbs tiny amount of water, the remaining water just overflows. That means there isn't enough space between it. Suppose if you want to, based on these observations, if you try to categorize how a solid look, how a liquid piece look, how the gas looks. So if the space between the atoms are very less, very less, and they are arranged in an order, then we call it solid. And the space between them is slightly more than solid but not as close as the solid, then it is a liquid. And the gas particles are further from each other. So a gas has, the gas particles have so much space between them, whereas liquid particles have very less space than the gases, and solids almost have, we can't simply say that almost no space, but still it absorbs tiny amount. And the solid atoms are regularly arranged, rigid, and less space compared to liquids and gases. These are the major things that we can talk about this. That is, let me just simply summarize this. Matter is something that gives us touch or feel sensation, that occupies space and has mass, We can simply say that a matter has volume and mass, and matter is divided into five major parts. The five major parts being solid, liquid, gases, and plasma, and Bose-Einstein condensate, Beck. That's how it is, in short called, the abbreviation of that. So liquids and gases are called together fluids, and solid, which is rigid, and plasma, this is an ecstatic state of matter, while this is available on earth that we can artificially make. And these three are something that in our everyday life, this is present in our surroundings, and we can make this using special equipments. And plasma, which is made, the stars are made of this plasma stuff. Here the major thing about it is atoms or molecules are available in its original form. Here the electrons are no longer revolving around the nucleus. In this solids or liquids or gases, the atoms may lose one or two electrons but still has electrons revolving around it. But in star stuff, the nuclei are separate and the electrons are revolving around are separate. That is why the property of plasma is completely different from solid, liquid, and gases.